Okay, here's my interlude. And by this I mean it's going to be kind of a vague rant that is very general. And you can skip it if you want, but I think you might learn a lot about my views about mining and about this phrase, mining centralization, that I don't agree exists. And I'm going to try to explain why in this section. But it's going to be a lot of random complaining. So how relevant is mining to main chain Bitcoin investors and users? In my view, it's almost completely irrelevant. So mining is innovative and important. Miners and their decisions are not. This is mostly about main chain Bitcoin core. For sidechains, the miners actually are more important because they sign off on those withdrawals, but not so for the main chain. And that's the focus of this presentation. Because again, we push those problems away and say, okay, you're the Monero sidechain developer, it's on you to make that work. So here I'm going to begin my complaining. This is something from the Cato Institute, whom you think would be a natural ally of Bitcoin, but unfortunately no. So in general, this is just one example of many. I'm going to give another one in a moment, right in the very next slide. But where a point about miners becomes a point about Bitcoin. There's this very kind of magician's trick where you're distracted. There's the misdirection, and then, however, if it makes sense for any two group of miners to form a pool, it also makes sense for any group of miners to form a pool. And blah, blah, blah. Therefore, these tendencies to centralization are totally destructive. Totally destructive. Wow. Okay. Of the Bitcoin system, the central innovations of Bitcoin are distributed trust in the absence of any single point of failure. Here's the other one. It's from everyone's favorite Bitcoiner, Mike Hearn. The resolution of the Bitcoin experiment, commenting on Y Combinator. Talking about how when he was preparing for Bitcoin XT, he went and talked to the Chinese miners. They could accept whatever. They changed their mind. Now they're telling the classic guys whatever. Western miners aren't much better. The miners, in general, have whatever. They may have better luck, as if luck meant anything. Blah, blah, blah. Therefore, Bitcoin is controlled by the Chinese government and grows or shrinks at their whim. That's a dark place, Mike. It's too bad. I'm sorry you feel that way. So Bitcoin is not equal to mining. Mining is, in my view, the single core additional. Mining is, in my view, the single new puzzle piece that makes it all work. But Bitcoin is protected by a lot of awesome things that were invented way before mining, such as proof of work, which was invented by Dr. Back, and that proof of work is different from mining. Satoshi invented a fun way to use proof of work and store it up and measure it cumulatively and intertwine it with a monetary system. So mining is like a fun game of proof of work. But on top of that, we have digital signatures, cryptographic hash functions, BitTorrent, and they provide Bitcoin with security that's unrelated to mining. Now here's from Satoshis Whitepaper, the purposes of mining, because there's a contraction here, and, which means that there are at least two. Starts a new coin owned by the creator of the block. This adds an incentive for nodes to support the network and provides a way to initially distribute the coins into circulation. So here's Satoshi's paper about the purposes of mining, because there's a contraction and here, which means there's at least two. Starts a new coin. This adds an incentive for nodes to support the network. That's the one that everyone knows about. And then provides a way to initially distribute coins into circulation. Now, in my view, this is a more important problem than supporting the network. If the concept of double spending is to have any meaning, we need to coordinate on a single network. Satoshi had just given all the coins to himself and his friends. It would guarantee that Bitcoin would fail. Instead, you have to give them out in a completely impartial, completely objective way. And that is amazing. And the only reason I bring it up is because it's never affected by any centralization and it's never affected by any side chains. So I do think it's more important. People think I'm being facetious about that. I am not. So I think I'm going to claim a greater than 50% victory. But now let's talk about this one, which is the one that is talked about. So there's a difference between mining, the process, and miners, the agents. And by miners, I refer to the miners themselves as well as their choices. So mining is important, but miners aren't. And you might think that this is a contradiction, but I don't think so at all. I see it as similar to the distinction between competition and competitors. So what would an anti-competitive law be like? It would be something that says, like, you have to buy from one store. You can only buy your bread from XYZ supermarket, right? But you see, that would be blatantly anti-competitive, but it would help the one individual competitor. It's really our indifference that promotes health. If a restaurant fails, we allow it to fail. This adds accountability to each restaurant owner. And since we make sure that there are always enough restaurants around that we don't care if they fail. We're robust to the collapse of restaurants, which is why in New York you can get food of all shapes and sizes. All kinds of ethnic food. You can get dollar pizza at 4 a.m. You can go to an expensive restaurant. And similarly, we have this giant, diverse web of life on planet Earth. Our species has been to the moon. We've occupied every ecological niche. And this is only possible because Mother Nature watched as all the intermediate species died. And there have been, in fact, something like 6 extinction events where over 75% of the species died. And the only reason large multicellular life is possible at all is because there was this giant oxygenation extinction event that killed almost everything on the planet. And that would have been a great time to centrally plan and intervene, but in saving the primitive bacteria, they would have accidentally prevented the rise of all other multicellular life. So there's this scale fallacy of looking at the individual miners versus the bigger picture. It's like you got to look at life instead of the individual living organisms. Death is the magic that makes life possible. It's kind of dark, but it's the result of biology. So again, mining is a process where anyone can join. It was invented by Satoshi. It's written down in rules and paper and code. It's amazing and wonderful. Miners are the actual people who choose to mine. And it's boring and irrelevant, as are their choices. So one choice, what am I talking about with these choices? I'm talking about location, I'm talking about strategy, and I'm talking about hardware and software. So people complain about all the miners are in China. So people complain about location. I view it as exactly the same as complaining about miners using a specific type of ASIC. What's the difference between the most efficient location and the most efficient ASIC? Nothing. They're all just the same complaint about efficiency. But all miners must efficiency maximize or they will get fired by the protocol. And efficiency improvements are good because, or so I thought, our goal was to support the network with a high hash rate. Another thing is that specialization, whether it's in terms of hardware or location, it helps maximize security, specifically versus rented hash power, such as botnets and Amazon Web Services. So a general thing can be redeployed in a lot of different ways, but a specialized thing can only be used for its one thing. And why would anyone do a specialized thing? It's because the specialized things are more effective. So what I'm talking about is if we didn't have miners in China, it would be cheaper to attack Bitcoin, potentially much cheaper to attack Bitcoin from China. So I just don't understand. It's like saying we shouldn't use ASICs. If an ASIC chip design is out there, then the attacker is just going to buy those. The attacker doesn't care about our weird rules. Miners must take all efficiency improvements. They must efficiency maximize. This is the plan from the beginning. So I don't understand. It's like, so I see it as very much another biology metaphor, is these plants. They do this funny thing if you have indoor plants. I once had a plant that covered the entire window. It was huge. And it just covered and moved. The plants bend toward the light, and they really like to cover windows if you give them a chance. And someone who is very naive and knows nothing about biology might be confused, and they may think like, there's something wrong with my plant, it's not growing straight. You know, I mean, can you imagine how ridiculous that would sound to an educated person who knows that plants use photosynthesis, energy from the sun, and so as far as the plant is concerned, this direction towards this vector of light is straight. I mean, I just don't understand how anyone could say such a thing, and yet The metaphor is that this is the direction of ASICs and the direction of China. Direction of cold land with cheap power nearby. The direction of capital controls. Here's another thing that I do not understand. So first of all, 20,000 hubris points to these gentlemen. Bitcoin is broken, and not just superficially so, but fundamentally at the core protocol level. The problem is intrinsic to the entire way Bitcoin works. This was written on November 4th, 2013, which is about 34 months ago. So either they're using a different definition of the word broken, or the mistake is with them. So again, I'm going to call this mining strategy, and I'm going to say it's exactly the same as complaining about location or ASICs. There are slight subtle differences. So one reason people complain about location is that they're worried that the Chinese government, which is like a single party communist kind of pseudo-fascist state, will roll in with some tanks and they will commandeer all the mining equipment. I'm going to talk about that later. And this one is different. Everything in the strategy category is actually different because it's worse, and I'm going to explain that on this slide, which will be the last slide about this, which I've titled "The Majority is Always Enough." This graph is from the paper, and it contains a disproof of the paper, and yet the authors included it anyway, so I'm going to enjoy walking you through this. The interesting thing about these mining strategy improvements is that they are relative. So if everyone copies the strategy, you end up exactly where you were before, minus some headache of going through with this process. And in this case, the headache is pretty large because this strategy involves getting ahead and staying ahead and keeping other people behind. So it ends up actually with like 8 blocks being found at once, and then like 17 blocks being found at once, and like weird kind of lurching forward that is only inconvenient to everyone. But let me explain what's going on. This graph here has pool size. So this is 0.5. This means you've got 50% of the hash rate. This is relative pool revenue. So this honest mining is a black line here, which I've copied over here. And it goes from 0, 0 to 0.5, 0.5. So it's exactly the same. One slope deal. And then against that, there's this innovative mining strategy, which is dependent on certain parameters, but slightly worse at first, but better if you have a bigger pool size. So here I've plotted this strategic progression, and I'm going to have this is you or your team, and this is a rival team. And so you read this paper and you think this is great. I'm going to get a big group, and I'm going to switch from black to red. I'm going to use the selfish mining strategy. And so now I get bigger relative pool revenue, and blue gets worse revenues. Just like with ASICs, blue is going to copy you. It's even easier when it's just software. So blue says, well, 2 can play at that game. I'm going to get an even bigger pool. And now I'm going to get an even higher revenue. And the reason I say this graph contains a disproof is that this distance here on the right, is this vertical distance is greater than the vertical distance over here on the left between the curved line and the straight line. So it's actually obvious, or it should be obvious, that the incentive accelerates. And then you say you've responded to that. Now you're getting a lower relative revenue. You're upset. You're doing worse than you were originally. And you say, okay, I'm going to argmax this graph. I'm going to hit the highest point on the graph. I'm going to get a big pool with 50% of the hash rate. And now I have the best, and blue sucks. And then blue player will copy you. And you'll have 2 mining pools that have half of the hash rate, and they will basically just be inconveniencing each other. So because, again, it's relative pool revenue, both of them end up exactly where they are before, just with a lot of annoyance in the meantime. And we're going to talk a lot about the Folk theorem later, so just keep it in mind. Maybe watch that section and then come back here and think about why it's obvious that this paper has not affected your life in the last 34 months, if they have been Bitcoin months. Now, someone might argue that, okay, well, this one goes up to 50. What if I get 60% of the hash rate? So there's going to be a lot of percentages here. So just imagine that there's 100 miners, and 60 of them form this gold group here, and 40 of them form the group here. Well, selfish mining is actually too effective with greater than 50% of the mining. It means you'll get all of the revenue, and your adversary will get none. And to the untrained eye, it might seem that your adversary has been vanquished permanently, but it's quite the reverse. Since they're currently getting nothing, they can very easily be bribed with epsilon, a small amount. So if you divided this group of 60 miners into quarters, so 4 groups of 15, one of those groups of 15, this lower group here, star quarter 1, right now they get all of the revenue possible, 100%, and they can split it 4 ways by hash rate. So they're currently getting 0.25, which is very good because there's only 15 out of 100 miners getting 25% of the total revenues. But what's even better than getting 25% is getting everything. So all you have to do is bribe these guys a little bit, and you can get everything for yourself. And reducing this top group from getting 0.75 to 0. Now they are the 45 group. You're a 55 group. People will continue to backstab each other until you're back to this point, at which point everyone might realize that they have only harmed themselves and they might stop doing this altogether. In reality, of course, no one would even bother trying this, which is they clearly did not. So again, location, hardware, strategy, software, I don't care. It's all so predictable and meaningless to me that I don't understand where people are coming from when they complain about fictional ideas like miner centralization. And I'm gonna continue my rant about that as we continue. So miners cannot do very much. This is a wall of text I'm gonna read. I'm gonna read it to you. Individual miners. What can miners do? They can only filter transactions for their block. If they form a giant group of miners, they can only order and reorder transactions. Now, by what criteria might they exercise these abilities? Well, transactions have no inherent identities nor any inherent context. And as fungibility improves, which is crucial, but as it improves, the identities and context will be even further eliminated. As a result of this, there's no basis for arbitrary censorship, only for economic rationing. So it's a complete meritocracy because there's no identities or context. So it doesn't matter where you were born or who your parents were. Only the details of your transaction matter, which is ideal. It's one of the most ideal things possible. Now again, with 51%, miners can attempt to reorder or refilter transactions in the immediate past at tremendous cost/risk, because if the attack fails, which it might for several reasons, double agents, bad luck, manual intervention, the attacking miners lose and the rival miners win. An even greater risk is that the attack succeeds and all of the mining equipment loses all of its value. So life is tough for the miners. Here are some things that miners can't do. They can never steal any money. They can never move money without a private key. Sidechains, ironically, notwithstanding. But again, see my blog for details about that. And miners can never print. They can never mint new bitcoins in excess of the predetermined schedule. Any rational person would just assume that there are 21 million bitcoins already. Some of them just won't move for a while. So no new bitcoins can be printed by the miners ever. So in order to execute a profitable attack, and we are going to talk about soon, we're going to talk about what if the Chinese government commandeers all the mining equipment. But in order to do a profitable attack, miners are going to have to double spend with their funds. And yet, their attack is going to affect all funds. So this is difficult for the miners. They're going to have to give up the security guarantee everywhere in order to attack once with one bundle of money. It could be many small bundles of money, but the point is there's a big asymmetry. They hit everything with a penalty, and they get special privilege with their money, which is a small amount. The really cool thing about this, it's my favorite thing about Bitcoin's design, is that we are inherently protected by the subjectivity of this answer to this question of how many confirmations is enough. If you're worried about something, you can just wait for more confirmations. But more interesting than that, if you ship a physical good, you usually have a lot of time to contact the shipping authorities and cancel the shipment or reverse it. Usually way more than 1 hour, 6 confirmations. You usually have a very long time. So for physical goods, the confirmation concept is very, very, very solid. Of course, what would a miner double spend if they were going to do this profitable attack? They would probably go to an exchange and try and transfer the bitcoins for money and then try and rewrite that so that the bitcoins never made it into the exchange in the first place. But the interesting thing about this is that it is itself very slow to move and withdraw US dollars. So it's to our benefit that the fiat currency transfers are very slow. And so the point of this slide is that miners have a very low ability to be mean to us. There's just not a lot they can do. The only things they can do are so unprofitable that it's extraordinarily unlikely that they could ever be incentive compatible. The only thing they could really do is they'd have to make it like a 2-week or like a 1-week reorganization. And if miners were to breach the rules in such a flagrant and they were going to play this nuclear option, then I think we would be justified in playing our own nuclear option of changing the proof of work hash function and firing all the miners, which I'm going to talk about a few slides from now. With the Lightning Network, things get even worse. So its fungibility improves, and with Lightning Network, I mean, within certain parameters, if you use the Lightning Network, you never have to actually touch the blockchain again. Even when you do, if you're a Lightning Network user, if you do need to check in with the blockchain, you have a very long time. 1,000 blocks, 2,000 blocks. You can customize it again, which is very, very, very cool. It's the coolest thing. If mining conditions worsen, you can say, I want 5,000 blocks. But you have a long time to get your transaction in. You can cycle through many, many individual miners that are competing with each other in order to. So this is it's very hopeless if miners want to do anything mean. This is a fortress. Not only is it a fortress, but the miners themselves are on a very short leash and not in a position to make any threats. They are more like subsistence farmers or robots or something. Competition erases profits because any cleverness is copied by rivals, and the rivals compete and pass those benefits on to consumers. In our case, the benefits are the hash rate. Uncopyable resources become rents. I'm not going to get into this. It's very arcane. But long story short, if you have a parcel of land that is really good for mining bitcoins on, then the value of this is transferred into the land itself and away from you. Value is constantly being erased and pushed away from you. The land becomes a valuable asset that you own, but it contains the value, not you. That's kind of this point here. Mining is very competitive. Anyone can join at any time. There's no barriers to entry. Anyone can start providing hashes. Each hash has an equal chance, mathematically equal chance of winning. Every 2 weeks, the bottom performers are cut from the team. It's the most brutal competition imaginable. But it's nothing compared to the competition of the equipment itself with a near infinite family of hash function combinations. So this is our nuclear option that I alluded to before. Talk about a short leash. Here's the greatest asymmetry I've ever noticed in my entire life between producer and consumer. Changing the proof of work hash function is a trivial detail for programmers. It's a temporary inconvenience for users, and we can improve. We can make it less inconvenient. We can do a couple different things. I don't even think we need to, but we could do things to make this setup healthier, but it's permanently devastating for miners. So imagine you call up your internet service provider and you say you want to switch to someone else. That's bad news for them, but imagine that you and a couple other people get together and you decide, okay, we're just going to fire this internet service provider for everyone, and all of their assets and equipment, all of their office space, all of their professional networks, all that stuff is just evaporates, just disintegrates. It's just gone. It's oblivion. Poor miners. I mean, I feel bad for the miners. Yeah, I think you have to. They are in such a weak strategic position. They're not in a position to make threats, which is the source of all power. Not electrical power, the better kind. Which brings me to this point here, which is my second to last point, which I call the flow of influence. Here's Brian Armstrong, famous Coinbase person. Luckily, Bitcoin has a built-in upgrade mechanism with an elegant design. If a majority of Bitcoin miners vote for a particular upgrade, then by definition, this is the new version of Bitcoin. I chose this statement because it implies that the miners have influence. It implies that the miners vote and then we decide. So I don't want to get into the details of how this is completely wrong for hard forks and only at best half right for soft forks, or right in a very irrelevant way. I just chose it because it implies a certain perspective that I disagree with. And I'm going to try to walk you through this is my perspective right here. And I'm going to try to walk you through it. Time goes from left to right. And influence flows through these yellow arrows, mostly from right to left-ish. And I'm going to walk you through this spiral shape, blue arrow, red arrow, green arrow, tan arrows. I'm going to walk you through this spiral as I explain my point of view. So first in time, Satoshi had an idea. He had an idea about something that he thought would be useful. He thought he could meet a need, transactional need. He thought he could satisfy some demand. I have a quote on my notes over here. The root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work. You see a problem that needs to be solved, so it's useful for something. So in certain cases, the darknet markets, the need is very clear. We have also philosophical reasons. We have privacy reasons. Maybe people want to store money in a brain wallet. How cool is that? It's an amazing application of technology. But the point is that people want Bitcoin for things at various points in time in the future. So they need Bitcoin at various times in various quantities, and the dearness of this need varied. Some people really need Bitcoin, some people they could take it or leave it. And some people need 4 Bitcoin, and some people need 13 Bitcoin. There are variations in price, quantity, demand here. I could have made these triangles different sizes. I probably should have thought of that. Anyway, the fact that this need exists in the future is what powers the investor's ability to do intertemporal arbitrage. Arbitrage is buying low and selling high. Intertemporal means at different points in time. So investors examine their own assessment of the future and their own liquidity profile today, and they see if there's any overlap there. And so they are responsible for buying and selling in markets and trying to smooth out these large swings in demand, and they, as a result, create a spot price today. This spot price directly affects the purchasing power of each block reward. So that's the 12.6 Bitcoins, the subsidy plus the fees. And this spot price, whether or not it goes into US dollars or any fiat currency at all, this is what determines the spot price. Again, whether or not it ever touches fiat, it determines how much electrical power and how much hardware miners can purchase. And that determines the quantity of mining, in my view. So my view is that the users have some need. The developers attempt to meet that need. Investors assess whether or not developers have succeeded, or they anticipate success in the future. And this assessment causes the current quantity of mining. So I have a very different view. And I think my view is supported by evidence, particularly Ethereum Classic. Ethereum Classic came out. It initially had very low mining, very low obscure price. It had some over-the-counter trading, but both were very low. And then it was listed on Poloniex where the price began to rise. Investors appreciated it for certain qualities they felt it had. And the mining followed it up in the future. So in my view, miners are lowest on the hierarchy of influence. So I have a different view than Brian Armstrong. In Brian Armstrong's world, the Ethereum miners would have just decided, and that would have been the new version of Ethereum, end of story. Finally, my last point, mining is a shadow. What do I mean by that? Well, here's my conclusion. Users have a safe relationship with miners. Miners don't have many decisions to make. Some 3 yes or no decisions. And the decisions they do make are constrained because they must walk the path of efficiency, improving their hardware, software, location, strategy, etc. as much as they can. So miners are on a short leash and not in a position to make threats. Mining is caused by investors, which is in itself caused by other things. It is not a cause of anything. Now here's this idea, risk of centralization of mining. An important concern is whether the introduction of sidechains with mining fees places resource pressure on miners, creating Bitcoin's centralization risks. I have a different blog post where I attempt to define centralization. I define it as the cost of running a full node. I think that's the amazing thing about Bitcoin, that anyone can become a node and any individual node can regenerate the entire network all by itself. The network can make progress without any identity. And so I think the real magic behind Bitcoin and the value it creates is in the node network. The node network creates value for individuals. And so I think mining is just a shadow of that value. It doesn't do anything. It's just a function of the value created by the node network. So I reject this phrase. I would love to have someone define it so we could maybe talk more about it. It conflates geographic concentration with the idea that something has a center that is privileged. So like you could go to MasterCard headquarters and prevent WikiLeaks from getting money. PayPal, eGold, Liberty Dollar, Liberty Reserve, these are examples of a centralization that is, I think, completely different from the fact. Where does it end? Asia has more than half of the population of humans, so is Bitcoin centralized because more humans live in the northern hemisphere? Where's it going to end? All the miners are on the planet Earth. One asteroid could destroy all the mining equipment.